The autumn wind of 1876 carried the scent of dying leaves and dying dreams. Across the makeshift auction grounds outside Fort Abraham Lincoln, Sarah Mae Thompson stood at the edge of the crowd, her worn calico dress patched at the elbows, clutching a single crumpled dollar bill. Her last earthly possession, save for the clothes on her back and the fire burning in her green eyes. Next up, we have Thunder's ghost, bellowed auctioneer Hiram Blackwood, his voice cutting through the crisp Dakota Territory air like a cavalry saber. This here Mustang was captured during our recent campaign against the Lakota. Wild as the devil himself and twice as mean. The magnificent stallion reared against his ropes, his midnight coat gleaming despite weeks of captivity. His eyes held the same untamed spirit that had once roamed free across the endless plains before the battle. Of the little bighorn had changed everything. The horse's powerful muscles rippled beneath his hide as he fought against his bonds, refusing to submit even in defeat. Wealthy ranchers and army officers surrounded the auction block, their pockets heavy with gold coins and their hearts heavy with the burden of recent losses. Colonel Marcus Whitman adjusted his blue uniform, still bearing the dust of too many battles, and called out, "I'll start the bidding at $50, set," shouted cattle baron Jefferson Hayes, his silver spurs jingling as he shifted his considerable weight. Sarah Mae's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had walked 3 days from the burned remains of her family's homestead, destroyed in the aftermath of Custer's defeat at the Little Bighorn. Her father and brothers had ridden with the 7th Cavalry and never returned. Her mother had succumbed to grief and fever, leaving Sarah Mae alone with nothing but her father's final words echoing in her memory. Sometimes, girl, the wildest things recognize kindred spirits. $100. The bidding climbed higher as Thunder's ghost continued his defiant dance, his hooves striking sparks against the wooden platform as the price soared beyond her reach. Sarah Mae stepped forward, her voice barely a whisper. At first, $1. The crowd fell silent, then erupted in cruel laughter. "Did you hear that?" cackled Mrs. Prudence, Hartford, the banker's wife. "The orphan girl thinks she can buy a war horse with pocket change." According to records from the Dakota Territory Historical Society, such auctions were common following the Indian Wars, as captured horses were sold to fund military operations and compensate settlers for losses incurred during the conflicts that reshaped the American frontier. $1, Sarah Mae repeated, louder this time, her chin raised with stubborn pride. Auctioneer Blackwood wiped tears of mirth from his eyes. "Little miss, this here horse is worth more than you'll see in a lifetime. Why don't you run along and buy yourself some penny candy?" But something extraordinary happened in that moment of ridicule. Thunder's ghost stopped his struggling and turned his magnificent head toward Sarah Mae. Their eyes met across the crowd, to survivors recognizing something indefinable in each other. The stallion's ears pricked forward, and he released a low, rumbling whinny that seemed to say, "I see you, and you see me." The mockery died on the wind as horse and girl stared at each other, understanding passing between them like lightning striking the earth. The laughter from the crowd slowly faded as Thunder's ghost remained perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on Sarah Mae with an intensity that made even the hardened cavalry officers shift uncomfortably. The wind had stilled, and in that pregnant silence, something ancient and primal stirred her, recognition that transcended the boundaries between human and beast, between the civilized and the wild. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered Sergeant Patrick. O'Malley, a grizzled veteran of countless frontier skirmishes, He had seen horses broken by the best riders, had watched stallions submit to the whip and bit, but never had he witnessed such a moment of pure connection. Colonel Whitman cleared his throat, his military bearing faltering slightly. Now see. Here, this is highly irregular. The girl clearly doesn't have the means to properly care for such an animal. The bidding stands at $100, Blackwood announced, though his voice had lost its earlier bluster. He glanced nervously between the wealthy bidders and the strange tableau before him. Thunder's ghost took a step forward, his massive hooves thudding against the wooden platform. The ropes that had held him secure suddenly seemed inadequate, not because of his strength, but because of his newfound purpose. His gaze never wavered from Sarah May, and she felt something stir deep within her chest, recognition of shared loss, shared wildness, shared refusal to be broken by the world's cruelties. 125, called out Judge Cornelius Pemberton, determined to end this unseemly display. But Sarah May stepped closer to the platform, her bare feet silent on the dusty ground. "I know what it's like," she whispered, her words somehow carrying to the stallion's ears despite the distance. "I know what it's like to lose everything, to be captured and caged and told you're worth nothing." The horse's ears flicked forward, and he stretched his neck toward her, straining against his bonds. $150. The bidding. War continued around them, but it felt distant now, irrelevant to the drama unfolding between girl and beast, Sarah. May reached into her worn pocket and pulled out something else, a small piece of jerky, her last morsel of food. She held it out toward Thunder's ghost, her hand steady despite her hunger. "I don't have much," she said softly, "but what I have, I'll share." The stallion's nostrils flared as he caught the scent, but more than that, he seemed to understand the sacrifice she was making. Here was a creature offering her last meal to him, asking for nothing in return but recognition. $200. The bidding had reached astronomical heights for a frontier auction, but the wealthy men were no longer bidding on just a horse. They were bidding against something they couldn't understand or control. Auctioneer Blackwood raised his gavel, sweat beading on his brow despite the cool autumn air, going once at $200. Thunder's ghost reared up on his hind legs, his front hooves pawing the air, and released a trumpet call that echoed across the Dakota plains, a sound of such wild beauty and desperate longing that it silenced every voice in the crowd. When his hooves touched down again, he looked directly at Sarah May and gave a soft, almost gentle nicker, going twice. Sarah May closed her eyes and made a prayer to whatever gods watched over orphaned girls and wild horses. When she opened them again, she saw something that made her heart leap. Thunder's ghost was watching her with what could only be described as trust. The gavel hung in the air, poised to fall and seal the stallion's fate with men who would break his spirit and harness his power for their own purposes. But in that suspended moment, Sarah May and Thunder's ghost had already made their choice. They had chosen each other. The gavel trembled in Hiram, Blackwood's weathered hand as he prepared to bring it down, sealing Thunder's ghost's fate to the highest bidder. The crowd held its collective breath, sensing they were witnessing something beyond a simple horse auction, something that would be talked about around campfires and kitchen tables for generations to come. $200, going 3 times weight. The voice that rang out across the auction grounds belonged not to Sarah May, but to an unexpected figure emerging from the crowd. Captain William Thornfield stepped forward, his blue cavalry uniform immaculate despite the frontier dust, his silver hair catching the afternoon sun. The gathered crowd recognized him immediately. hero of the Civil War. A man whose word carried weight even among the territory's elite. Captain Thornfield, Colonel Whitman acknowledged with a respectful nod. "Have you come to place a bid?" The captain's weathered face bore the lines of a man who had seen too much war, too much loss. His eyes, steel blue and sharp as winter sky, surveyed the scene before him. "I have indeed, Colonel, but not in the way you might expect." He walked slowly toward Sarah May, his spurs chiming softly with each step. The crowd parted before him like wheat before the wind. When he reached the girl, he studied her face with the intensity of a man reading a map of territory he'd never explored. "Young lady," he said, his voice carrying the authority of command but tempered with unexpected gentleness, "what's your name?" "Sarah May Thompson, sir," she replied, her chin still raised with defiant pride despite her obvious fear. "Thompson, ... The captain's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Would that be Lieutenant James Thompson's daughter? James Thompson of the 7th Cavalry? Sarah May's breath caught in her throat. "You knew my father." "Knew him?" Captain Thornfield's expression softened. "James Thompson saved my life at the Battle of Gettysburg. Took a Confederate bullet meant for me." He paused, studying her face and seeing echoes of a fallen comrade. "I heard he rode with Custer at the Little Bighorn." The girl's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "He never came home, sir. None of them did." A murmur rippled through the crowd as they realized they were witnessing something more profound than a simple auction. This was about honor, about debts that transcended money, about the sacred obligations between soldiers who had faced death together. Thunder's ghost seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. The great stallion stood perfectly still now, his ears pricked forward, as if he too understood that his fate hung in the balance of something larger than commerce. "Captain." Thornfield reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of gold coins. "Mr. Blackwood," he called out, his voice carrying across the grounds like a battle command. "I bid $500 for this horse." Gasps arose from the crowd. It was an astronomical sum, more than most frontier families saw in a year. "Judge," Pemberton sputtered in protest, "Captain, surely you can't be serious. $500 for a captured Mustang? Oh, but I am serious, Judge. Dead serious." The captain's eyes never left Sarah May's face. "But I'm not bidding for myself." He turned to address the entire gathering, his voice rising to carry to every corner of the auction grounds. "Ladies and gentlemen, this horse was captured in the same campaign that claimed the life of Lieutenant Thompson, a man who died serving his country with honor. His daughter stands before us with nothing but her courage and a dollar that represents everything she has left in this world." The captain placed a gentle hand on Sarah May's shoulder. "I'm placing this bid on behalf of Miss Thompson. The money comes from a debt I owed her father, a debt I've carried for 13 years, waiting for the chance to repay it." Thunder's ghost whinnied softly, as if approving of this turn of events. The sound carried across the silent crowd like a benediction. $500, Blackwood repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Going once, ... The wealthy bidders stood in stunned silence, understanding that they were no longer competing against money, but against honor itself, and honor, they knew, was a currency they could never match. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the auction grounds as Captain Thornfield's words settled over the crowd like dust after a cavalry charge. $500, a fortune that represented more than mere currency. It represented the invisible bonds between soldiers, the sacred debts that war creates, and the honor that follows good men beyond the grave. Judge Pemberton adjusted his spectacles, his face flushed with indignation. "Captain, this is highly irregular. The girl placed a bid of $1 surely, that cannot be legally binding when she lacks the means to fulfill it." "With respect, Judge," Captain Thornfield replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Miss Thompson's bid was made in good faith with all the money she possessed. That strikes me as more honorable than men bidding with money they've never missed." Sarah May stood frozen, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. The dollar bill in her hand seemed to burn against her palm as she struggled to comprehend what was happening. "Captain, sir, I cannot accept. You're not accepting charity, Miss Thompson," the captain interrupted gently. "You're allowing me to repay a debt of honor. Your father charged into Confederate lines at Pickett's charge to drag me to safety when I was wounded. I swore an oath that day that if anything happened to James Thompson, I would look after his family." Thunder's ghost pawed the ground restlessly, his dark eyes moving between Sarah May and the captain as if following their conversation. The magnificent stallion seemed to understand that his fate was being decided by forces beyond simple commerce, by the complex web of duty, honor, and sacrifice that bound frontier communities together. Mrs. Hartford sniffed disdainfully from her position near the front of the crowd. "Really, Captain, giving such a sum to an orphan girl, she wasted it within a month. And what does a child know about handling a wild horse?" Before the captain could respond, Sarah May stepped forward, her green eyes blazing with a fire that reminded everyone present why the frontier bred such strong women. "Ma'am, I may be an orphan, but I'm not ignorant. I've been around horses since I could walk. And this horse," she gestured toward Thunder's ghost, "he understands something you don't." "And what might that be, child?" Mrs. Hartford asked with barely concealed contempt. "He understands what it means to be free, and what it costs to survive when everything you've ever known is taken from you." As if summoned by her words, Thunder's ghost released a long, mournful whinny that seemed to echo across the entire Dakota Territory. It was a sound of loss and longing, of wild spaces and stolen freedom, but also of hope, the first note of hope the stallion had voiced since his capture. Auctioneer Blackwood wiped his brow nervously. "Captain Thornfield, your bid of $500 stands. Are there any other bids?" The wealthy ranchers and officers exchanged glances, but none spoke. How could they compete against honor? How could mere money stand against the sacred debt between soldiers who had bled together on distant battlefields? "Going once, ... Blackwood's voice cracked slightly. Thunder's ghost took a step toward the edge of the platform, his muscles rippling. Beneath his midnight coat, the ropes that held him seemed suddenly fragile, inadequate to contain such a force of nature. "Going twice, ... Sarah May looked up at Captain Thornfield, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "Sir, if you do this thing, if you help me claim this horse, I swear by my father's memory that I'll prove worthy of your trust and his sacrifice." The captain smiled, and for a moment the harsh lines of war faded from his face. "Miss Thompson, something tells me you were born worthy. Your father would be proud. Sold." The gavel fell with a sound like thunder, sealing a bond that transcended the simple exchange of money for livestock. Thunder's ghost belongs to Miss Sarah May Thompson. The crowd stood in stunned silence as the implications sank in. A penniless orphan girl had just acquired one of the finest horses in the territory, not through wealth or influence, but through the mysterious arithmetic of honor and sacrifice that governed life on the frontier. Thunder's ghost reared one final time, his hooves striking the air in what looked remarkably like a salute, then settled down to await his new mistress with the patience of a creature who had finally found where he belonged. The dust had barely settled from Blackwood's gavel when Sarah May approached the platform where Thunder's ghost stood waiting. The crowd remained clustered nearby, unwilling to disperse from what had become more than an auction. It had become a spectacle of frontier justice and frontier mercy intertwined. Captain Thornfield counted out gold coins into Blackwood's waiting palm, each clink of metal a testament to debts that ran deeper than money. "See that the paperwork is drawn up properly," he instructed the auctioneer. "Miss Thompson is to be listed as the legal owner, with no encumbrances." "Yes, sir, Captain. Right away, sir." But Sarah May had eyes only for the magnificent stallion. Before her, Thunder's ghost stood perfectly still now, his dark gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart race. She could feel the raw power contained within his frame, the barely leashed wildness that called to something equally untamed in her own spirit. "Easy, boy," she whispered, stepping closer. "I know you don't trust humans. Lord knows, after what we've both been through, trust is a precious commodity." The horse's ears flicked forward at the sound of her voice. Up close, she could see the intelligence in his eyes, the nobility of his bearing despite weeks of captivity. Scars marked his high evidence of his battles, against both his captors and his own desperate need for freedom. Sergeant O'Malley approached cautiously, a lead rope in his weathered hands. "Miss, you'll be wanting to get him properly secured for transport. This horse has thrown every rider who's tried to mount him, broke 3 good men's ribs and sent another to the Territory Hospital." Sarah May studied the ropes that bound Thunder's ghost to the platform. They were thick cavalry ropes, the kind used to restrain the most difficult mounts. But as she looked at them, she saw something else: symbols of captivity, of broken spirits and surrendered dreams. "Sergeant," she said, quietly, "I wonder if you might do me a kindness." "What might that be, miss?" "Cut those ropes." The request sent a ripple of alarm through the gathered crowd. Colonel Whitman stepped forward quickly. "Miss Thompson, that's extremely dangerous. This animal is unpredictable. He could bolt, or worse, he could attack." Sarah May never took her eyes off Thunder's ghost. "Colonel, with respect, if I'm to earn this horse's trust, I can't start by keeping him bound like a prisoner. We've both been prisoners enough." Captain Thornfield studied the young woman with growing admiration. "Sergeant O'Malley, do as the lady requests." "Sir, I must protest," Colonel Whitman began. "The horse belongs to Miss Thompson now," the captain interrupted firmly. "It's her decision to make." O'Malley hesitated, then drew his knife. The crowd held its collective breath as he approached Thunder's ghost. The stallion's muscles tensed, ready to explode into motion the moment his bonds were severed. The first rope fell away with a soft thud. Thunder's ghost remained motionless, but every line of his body spoke of coiled energy waiting to be released. The second rope followed, then the third, as the final rope fell to the platform. Thunder's ghost was free for the first time since his capture. The crowd stepped back instinctively, expecting him to bolt for the open plains visible in the distance. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his gaze fixed on Sarah May. She extended her hand, slowly, palm up, the same way she had offered him the jerky earlier. "I'm not going to try to ride you today, boy. I'm not going to put a bit in your mouth or a saddle on your back. Today, I just want you to know that you're free to choose." Thunder's ghost stepped delicately off the platform, his hooves silent, on the packed earth. He was close enough now that Sarah May could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could see the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "You can run if you want to," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. These plains stretch for hundreds of miles. You could disappear into the sunset and never see another human being. Or, ... She paused, swallowing hard. Or you could stay with me. We could be wild together, you and I. We could be free together. The stallion stretched his neck forward until his velvet muzzle nearly touched her outstretched palm. For a long moment they remained frozen in that tableau, girl and horse. Survivor and survivor, two creatures who had lost everything, finding something worth keeping in each other. Then Thunder's ghost gently touched his nose to her palm, and Sarah May felt a connection snap into place between them, strong as forged steel and gentle as morning sunlight. The crowd released its held breath in a collective sigh of wonder. Thunder's ghost's gentle touch sent a shock of recognition through Sarah May's entire being. The stallion's breath was warm against her palm, and in that simple contact she felt something she hadn't experienced since her family's death, the possibility of trust, of companionship, of not being utterly alone in an unforgiving world. The crowd remained motionless, afraid that any sudden movement might shatter the delicate connection forming between girl and horse. Even the wind seemed to have stilled, as if nature herself recognized the importance of this moment. "Well, I'll be switched," Sergeant O'Malley muttered under his breath. "Never seen anything like it." Thunder's ghost took another step closer, bringing his massive head down until it was level with Sarah May's. She could see her reflection in his dark eyes. And what she saw there was not the broken, desperate orphan the crowd saw, but something stronger, something that matched the wildness in the stallion's spirit. "That's right, boy," she whispered, slowly raising her other hand to touch his neck. "We understand each other, don't we?" The horse's skin twitched beneath her touch, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned slightly into her hand, accepting her presence in a way that made the watching crowd marvel. Captain Thornfield approached slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile bond being forged before their eyes. "Miss Thompson," he said, quietly, "you'll need somewhere to keep him. A horse like this requires proper shelter, feed, care." Sarah May's face fell as reality crashed back over her. In her joy at connecting with Thunder's ghost, she had forgotten the practical considerations. She had no home, no barn, no pasture. The burned remains of her family's homestead lay 3 days' walk away, and even if she could return there, she had no means to rebuild. I hadn't thought... she began, her voice trailing off as the impossibility of her situation became clear. Thunder's ghost seemed to sense her distress. He nickered softly and pressed his muzzle against her shoulder, offering what comfort. He could bet Mrs. Hartford chose that moment to speak up, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Of course, the poor child hadn't thought it through. This is what happens when sentiment overrules good sense. The horse will have to be sold again. "Naturally, like hell it will," growled a voice from the back of the crowd. All heads turned to see who had spoken with such vehemence. Old Pete Kowalski stepped forward, his gnarled hands gripping a walking stick carved from prairie oak. Pete owned a small ranch about 5 miles from town, nothing fancy, but honest. Work and honest land. He'd lost 2 sons in the Indian Wars, and had been growing increasingly bitter as the years passed. "Pete," Captain Thornfield looked surprised. "You have something to say." The old rancher's eyes were fixed on Sarah May and Thunder's ghost, and his weathered face held an expression of wonder. "I've been breaking horses for 40 years, he said slowly. Never seen anything like what just happened here. That horse chose her, sure as sunrise. And any fool can see she chose him right back." He hobbled closer, his keen eyes studying the pair. "Miss, you say you need a place for this horse." Sarah May nodded, afraid to hope. "Well then, I reckon I could use some help around my place. Got more land than I can manage these days, and the barn's half empty since I lost my string to raiders last spring." He paused, his gruff voice softening. "Course, I couldn't pay much in the way of wages, but there'd be room and board for you, and pasture and feed for your horse." The crowd murmured in surprise. Pete Kowalski was known for his cantankerous nature and his distrust of strangers. For him to offer charity to anyone, let alone an orphaned girl, was unprecedented. "Why?" Sarah May asked simply. "Why would you?" "Help me." Pete was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. "Because," he said finally, "sometimes a man gets tired of being angry at the world. Sometimes he sees something that reminds him what hope looks like." He gestured toward Thunder's ghost. "That horse there, he's been through hell, just like you have, but he ain't given up, and neither have you." Thunder's ghost raised his head and looked directly at Pete, as if evaluating this new addition to their small circle of allies. The stallion's ears pricked forward, and he gave a soft whicker that sounded remarkably like approval. Sarah May felt tears streaming down her cheeks, not tears of sorrow this time, but tears of gratitude and overwhelming relief. "Mr. Kowalski, I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me yet, girl. I work my help hard, and I expect honesty and effort in return. You think you can handle that?" Sarah May squared her shoulders, her hand still resting on Thunder's ghost's neck. "Yes, sir. I can handle anything, as long as I have him with me." Pete nodded approvingly. "Then I reckon we got ourselves a deal." He looked around at the dispersing crowd. "Rest of you folks can go home now. Show's over." But as the crowd began to scatter, Sarah May knew the real show was just beginning. She had a horse, a place to go, and for the first time since her world had collapsed, she had hope. Thunder's ghost nuzzled her shoulder again, and she could swear she heard him whisper in the wind, "Now we begin." 3 months had passed since that autumn day at the auction grounds, and the Dakota Territory had settled into the harsh embrace of winter. Snow covered the rolling hills around Pete Kowalski's ranch, but in the modest barn, warmth radiated from more than just the pot-bellied stove that Pete had installed for the animals. Comfort. Sarah May stood in Thunder's ghost's stall, running a curry comb through his magnificent coat. The stallion had filled out considerably since his arrival at the ranch, his ribs no longer visible beneath his hide, his eyes bright with health and contentment. More importantly, the wariness that had defined him during his captivity had transformed into something else, not submission, but partnership. "You're looking mighty fine this morning, boy," she murmured, working out a tangle in his mane. "Pete says if this weather breaks, we might try that trail ride we've been planning." Thunder's ghost turned his head to regard her with those intelligent dark eyes. Over the past months, they had developed a communication that went beyond words, beyond the traditional relationship between human and horse. He had never been broken in the conventional sense Sarah May had refused to allow it. Instead, they had learned to trust each other, to move together as partners rather than master and servant. The barn door creaked open, and Pete hobbled in, bringing a swirl of cold air and snow with him. "Morning, Sarah May. How's our boy today?" restless. She replied, scratching Thunder's ghost behind the ears. I think he knows something's coming. Pete nodded knowingly. Over the months he had spent watching girl and horse together, he had come to respect what he called their connection. There were times when Thunder's ghost would become agitated for no apparent reason, only to have riders appear on the horizon an hour later. Other times, the stallion would lead Sarah May to sick cattle or damaged fencing, as if he understood that his human partner needed his help to manage the ranch. Might be that visitor Captain Thornfield mentioned, Pete said, checking the water trough. Said he'd be coming by today with some news. Sarah May looked up in surprise. What kind of news? Before Pete could answer, they heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Thunder's ghost whinnied in recognition. He had learned to distinguish between the various horses that visited the ranch, and this particular pattern was familiar. Captain Thornfield appeared in the barn doorway, stamping snow from his boots. Good morning, Miss Thompson, Pete. He looked around the well-maintained barn with approval. I see you've made quite a home for yourself here. The captain's got something to tell you, girl, Pete said, his eyes twinkling with barely suppressed excitement. Sarah May set down the curry comb and gave Thunder's ghost a reassuring pat. What is it, Captain? Thornfield reached into his coat and withdrew an official-looking document. I've been corresponding with the territorial government about your situation, Miss Thompson. It seems that your family's homestead claim is still valid. The land belongs to you by right of inheritance. Sarah May's breath caught, but the house was burned, the fences destroyed. Land can be rebuilt on, the captain continued, and it turns out that your father had filed additional claims before his death claims that have been approved. You now own nearly 300 acres of prime Dakota Territory land. The implications hit her like a physical blow. 300 acres, enough land to build a real ranch, to raise horses, to create the kind of life she had only dreamed about during the dark months after her family's death. There's more, Captain Thornfield continued, his weathered face breaking into a smile. The territorial governor has approved a special program to help war orphans establish homesteads. You'll receive financial assistance to rebuild, plus a small herd of cattle to get you started. Thunder's ghost seemed to sense the importance of the moment. He stretched his neck over the stall door and nuzzled Sarah May's shoulder, offering his quiet support. I don't understand, she whispered. Why would they do this for me? Because, Pete said gruffly, your story got around. Word spread about what happened at that auction, about how you and this horse found each other. People started talking about what it means to be brave, what it means to never give up, even when everything's against you. Captain Thornfield nodded. You've become something of a symbol, Miss Thompson. A reminder that the frontier spirit isn't just about taking land or winning battles. It's about hope, about starting over, about the connections that make us human. Sarah May looked at Thunder's ghost, remembering that day when she had stood with only $1 to her name, and the whole world laughing at her dreams. Now she had land, opportunity, and most importantly, a partner who would share whatever adventures lay ahead. When can we go see it? She asked. The land, I mean. Soon as the weather breaks, Pete said. I'll ride out with you, help you get started. Of course, I'll miss having you around here, but a woman needs her own place. Thunder's ghost pawed the ground impatiently, as if eager to explore these new territories, to run free across land that would truly belong to them. Sarah May wrapped her arms around his powerful neck, burying her face in his mane. What do you think, boy? Ready to build something new? The stallion's answering whinny echoed through the barn like a trumpet call of victory, carrying with it all the wild promise of the frontier, the promise that sometimes, if you're brave enough and stubborn enough and true enough to your dreams, the sunset doesn't mark an ending. Sometimes it marks a beginning as spring approached and the snows began to melt. Sarah May Thompson and Thunder's ghost prepared to ride toward their destiny, toward 300 acres of Dakota, territory land where a poor girl's $1 bid would grow into a legacy that would endure long after the frontier had passed into memory. The wild horse had indeed followed her into the sunset, and together they had discovered that sometimes the most impossible dreams are simply the ones that take the longest to unfold.